Welcome everyone. Bienvenue à tout le monde. Welcome to our ongoing Pearson Center webinar series. I know that our new President CEO, Pam Damoff, who I'm happy to welcome to join us. I know Pam has a vision of turning this into a podcast, so perhaps you're listening to this as a podcast, and I think that's wonderful that the Pearson Center can adapt to the times and reach people and reach Canadians and have those conversations where they're located. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are joining you today, or at least I am joining you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We'd like to acknowledge that and begin our conversation within a spirit of true reconciliation. The Pearson Center, as I think folks know, is a multi-partisan dynamic think tank engaged in the active dialogue about Canada's future and building on the successes of the past and exploring the ideas of the Canada yet to come. I'd like to thank the Pearson Center's sustaining sponsors, MAPCO, Bruce Power, the Canadian Building Trades Union, and the Sandstone Group for their ongoing support. Today, we're going to take you behind the lines to talk about the recent speech from the throne from a number of recent parliamentarians who know how to read a speech from the throne and know how to read what it actually means, and not just the words on the paper. So we have a very august panel of former parliamentarians with us today. Peter Julien, what can you say about Peter Julien? What a career, 21 years of incredible experience as Member of Parliament from British Columbia, and deep respect, I would say, from people across the aisle and every corner of the House of Commons. So thank you, Peter, for joining us today. Ya'ara Saks, former Liberal MP, represented Toronto riding from 2020 to 2025, became our Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, and Associate Minister of Health. So thank you, Ya'ara, for taking time to join us. And Karen Vecchio, another well-respected member of Parliament, Conservative member of Parliament, but loved and respected by people from every section of the House of Commons. Was involved as chairing the Status of Women Committee for many years and got a number of wonderful reports, and I think all committee consensuses out of that committee. So really appreciate you joining us here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our mistress of ceremonies today, the wonderful Pam Damoff, who herself was a long-time 10-year member of Parliament, parliamentary secretary in a number of roles, and we are delighted that Pam is now our president CEO. So I'll take myself off the screen and turn it over to Pam. So thank you very much, Pam.
Thanks a million, Kevin, and thanks for the introduction. And first, thanks to my friends for joining us here today. And we're going to jump right in because we only have an hour, and we probably have a few hours worth of things that we could talk about. So, Peter, you served in the House longer than any of us. Can you give us the 1 minute Coles Notes version of what a throne speech is?
Delighted to, and thanks so much for hosting this forum. The throne speech is basically a statement of intent. It's the government's agenda. If you think of Parliament as one long meeting, this is the meeting agenda that the government puts forward on the very first day of Parliament. It's a statement of intent as well, because what that does is allow people across the country who have voted for parliamentarians in the recent election to then compare notes of what was committed to during the election campaign and what is being actually put forward in the speech from the throne. And the most important element, I guess, in a minority parliament is the fact that this is also the test of the government's agenda. The government is putting forward the agenda. In a minority parliament, does it have the confidence of the House of Commons? And that test in the coming days is also an important component of the throne speech. I think all of these things are very, very important. I look forward to getting into the details around this particular throne speech. But the reality is the government has now presented its meeting agenda that should be followed in the coming weeks by legislation. How often is followed by a budget? We'll get back to that a little bit later on, or an economic update. So the throne speech starts things off, and then the legislation, budget, the economic update follows.
Well, since you have the floor, maybe we'll let you go first. What were your thoughts? What was there, a short version of that? What did you like? What did you not like? Just overall general impressions. We'll get into more details in a little bit.
I think we would all agree as Canadians that the most important imperative right now is pushing back against the agenda coming from south of the border, and certainly the elements in the throne speech that touched on that, I think, were important. I have noticed, and many observers have said as well, that this was a throne speech that is very similar to previous throne speeches we've seen from conservative governments. And in fact, Stephen Harper, it was noted by numerous people who follow politics. Stephen Harper, with the singular exception perhaps of the references to supporting the CBC, Stephen Harper would have felt very comfortable giving this throne speech. And so there are references within the throne speech that I think are concerning. We'll get into that in a moment. But the reality is, beyond the overlay of the threat by the Trump administration to Canada, where I think all Canadians would be in agreement, there are many elements of the throne speech that I think signify a shift to the right. And I don't believe that that's necessarily what Canadians voted for.
Thanks, Peter. And of course, the throne speech was read this time by the king, which is something that is not doesn't happen every time. And I think that too is a important symbol for Canada as a part of the Commonwealth. Ya'ara, what were your general impressions of the throne speech?
So this is where I'll differ from Peter. Here we go. Throne speeches aren't just about setting the agenda for the meeting. I think they also set the tone. And for me, this was really, we could hear a lot about the sense of unity and national pride, of reminding ourselves who we are as Canadians in the world, how the world sees us, because I think for a while, certainly for many of us in the chamber, with the level of polarization that we've seen, and certainly as a Jewish Canadian, the level of anti-Semitism and hate overall that we've seen in the last few years, this was really an opportunity to remind ourselves that we need to celebrate our diversity, but really look and see each other and be unified in that strength. It is a unique mosaic in Canada, the fabric of this country and its diversity in languages and culture, rural to remote, to north to south, Indigenous, Métis, First Nation, and Inuit, to all of the pieces of the puzzle that make Canada today Canada, came out in that speech. And I think it was something that certainly for me was an important setting of the table of how parliamentarians, and I mean, we've all experienced this in the last session of Parliament, of how we relate to each other and how Canadians see us working together and also disagreeing together for the sake of advocating for what's important for Canadians today. So that was one of the big takeaways for me, that of setting the tone of how this Parliament should be.
Awesome, thank you. And last but certainly, what were your general impressions?
Well, I think we saw a lot of pomp and circumstance. And what we actually saw was across the entire world, people were tuning in to see the king. It was the third time that we've seen the sovereign bring forward the throne speech. So it was making that international news. So as Ya'ara had said, this was giving a tone and a platform for Prime Minister Carney to actually speak to many, many people, just not only here in Canada, but across the world. And I don't think we've ever really seen that before. Well, until, of course, his mother had done that. But I think that was really, really important. This was a perfect opportunity for him to go back to throne speeches. There's a lot of time it is reminding everybody why they're elected, what were some of their big things. I think the one biggest thing ever standing out to me in a throne speech is getting rid of the penny when Jim Flaherty did that under Prime Minister Harper. Other than that, there's usually kind of little pieces, and we'll discuss that today, but little pieces. And that's what we saw, was just an overall, this is what our big picture is, and how are we going to build from that. And as they said, right after there was a Ways and Means motion put forward. So although there was not a lot in the throne speech, they are moving forward in the House of Commons.
Awesome, thank you. Well, Karen, you and I worked together a lot when we were in Parliament on, issues of women's empowerment, gender-based violence. You did yeoman's work as the chair of the Status of Women Committee, and I know you made connections that I'm sure last to today with organizations across the country.
Mhm.
The Prime Minister initially didn't appoint a minister for women and gender equality in since the election he has. But there wasn't really anything in this throne speech focused on some of the issues that I know you and I care about, and
Yeah.
everyone on this call, actually. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, okay, let's start off with the lack of minister when he put that. I have this good friend named Marcy Ian, and her and I that Saturday night we just had a chat about this. It was very concerning because there were so many big issues that we're talking about. And prior to coming to Parliament, I really had no idea what privilege was. I'm not a rich woman by any means, but I'm privileged because I've had two parents that have loved and adored me and supported me. And that is something that over the last 10 years, if anything has changed, it's the realization that gosh, I'm a lucky person. And there are so many people that haven't had those opportunities. So when we look into the women's part, it opened my eyes to the importance of having an advocate there representing over 50% of the population. And then you work into those important things about, why did we get things like legislation saying that we needed 30% of women on boards, which I would like to say the statistics only sitting at about 37% or 38% on public trading companies, which is actually declining. We should be doing better on that. But justice for me is really, really important. And I would like to see a lot more on justice, which I didn't see in the throne speech. And I'm hoping there's lots to come because I think that is a system that is really lacking. And when the economy is not there to help families out, stress and financial stress does lead to the economic issues lead to abuse within the family. And so we need to make sure those resources are there for women and their families. And we do know it's gender-based, so we do know that there are men in those situations too. So to Peter, thank you very much for wearing that beautiful patch. There's an organization just like that is out there talking about violence against women. And with that, it has that beautiful patch showing the Indigenous side to everything too.
Yeah, thank you, Karen.
Thanks.
Yara, I'm going to turn to you now. You were Minister for Mental Health and Addictions, that ministry, and Associate Minister of Health, but the Mental Health and Addictions, that minister no longer exists. Um, it- the Prime Minister only issued one mandate letter, and I'm not sure how you apply that mandate letter to the health portfolio. Um, Given your passion on health and mental health and addictions, which you certainly have and continue to have, what were your thoughts on the throne speech?
So it's a great question, and I've been asked that a few times in the last few weeks since the election about this. And I'll say this: my philosophy is always that good social policy drives good economic policy, and there was a lion's share of work done in 2025, particularly, the Youth Mental Health Fund, which was a once in a generation investment of 500 million over the next 5 years in mental health. And we got it through Treasury Board. It's in the works and is rolling out. So I know when we talk about what does good social policy look like, Mark Carney has said this many times, we're investing in Canadians. So spend less, invest more. It may be that there isn't the foundational work is in there, whether it's pharmacare, whether it is the childcare plans that we've done, whether it's the emergency treatment fund, which we also got off the ground. Those things are in place and they're not being taken away. Will it be enough on the go forward? Time will tell. But again, if you make those investments in the social policy pieces, which we have, and I want to acknowledge Peter here on the work with the NDP that we did on pharmacare and on dental care to get those pieces rolling. It is the beginning. It's certainly not the end. And for many Canadians, there was a fear of those being cut, and those are firmly in place. So that's what I like to see is the dedicated portfolio, maybe, but I also think there's really a time where the provinces need to assume their role in this in a deeper way. There are bilateral agreements of $200 billion that we signed over the next 10 years, where mental health is a key part of those principles. And this is where we get to step up together because the foundation has been set.
Well, I half expected, Peter, you to jump in there and say, thanks to the NDP, which was a common
That was,
refrain we heard in
yes,
the House of
the
Commons.
siren call in the House from Peter.
Well, and this is where I have some difficulty. Ya'ara did terrific work as minister, and I appreciated all of the work that she put into that, as well as making those significant improvements thanks to the NDP on dental care. Pharmacare is a notable, I think, a notable lapse from this government when it was signaled in the throne speech that we would not be moving forward on pharmacare because the operative word was maintaining what exists now. What exists now was only the first step in pharmacare. And it covers diabetes medication and devices and covers contraception. Now, the reality is this will save a couple hundred lives a year from Canadians who have diabetes, who couldn't afford their medication. And as the Canadian Federation of Nurses Union has indicated, we lose about 200 people a year who can't afford their diabetes medication. There are many, many more Canadians that die because they can't afford to access heart medication and other medications that are essential for life. So for Mr. Carney to signal clearly in the throne speech that he is not moving forward with the next stage of pharmacare, which would include a whole range of other life-preserving essential medication, I find that profoundly disappointing. And when you couple it with the issue around fiscal discipline, looking to potentially cut back on services and cut back on the civil service, rather than cutting back on an immense amount of money from the federal government that goes to the corporate sector. I find that disturbing. So this is where we really hit the road in terms of the throne speech. If we're not moving ahead with pharmacare, even though we know that ultimately that is sentencing a few hundred Canadians over the next year to death because they won't be able to afford their medication and they will die as a result. This is the kind of essential element, emergency element that I think the government has to pick up on. And there's a very clear signaling that they will not do that. I find that disturbing and saddening, quite frankly.
Well, and Peter, it's not only about saving lives. It's multiple studies have been done that show that pharmacare is actually good economic policy, and it saves governments billions of dollars. If you take someone, you mentioned someone who can't afford their heart medication, what happens? They go home, they can't afford the hundreds of dollars for their prescription. They wait until it's an emergency, and then they go to the hospital, and they're now using emergency care. And I remember when I was parliamentary secretary for health, and that was when the Hoskins report came out and others. But there's certainly a strong economic argument for pharmacare as well.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And the pressure on the acute care system, because that person who can't afford their heart medication goes in the acute care system at a much higher cost to Canadians, puts pressure on our healthcare system. This is why the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, who has stepped down as leader, but who did show great leadership with the NDP caucus on this, why we push so hard for the next stage of pharmacare to be implemented. That starts in October. And we've had clear signaling from the throne speech that that's not going to happen.
I do want to talk about disability because it's something that I certainly worked on long before I was a parliamentarian. Some of the most vulnerable people in Canada, 40% of people living with a disability are living in poverty. And, we passed the Canada Disability Benefit. It's only, budgeted for $200 a month for folks. It's far below what they need. But I might open this up to all of you if that's okay. Maybe I'll start with you, Karen, but thoughts on just where we are for people living with disability. I do find those organizations are not as well organized as women's organizations. So, we no longer have a minister who's directly responsible. We don't have anybody in cabinet who lives with a disability either. So, though that voice is going to be missing around the cabinet table. So, I mean, Karen, and then maybe we'll turn to you, and Peter, I'll save you for last because I know you've done a ton of work on this issue. So
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to work on this or talk about this, because I think a lot about gender-based analysis plus, and that plus includes things like disability. So I think, first of all, when we look at the provinces, what are they currently providing to families? You know, what is available to those who are disabled, and what's available to parents who have disabled children? What's sitting there? That benefit of $200 is just such a small segment of whether it's mental health counseling. That would be maybe 2 times that you could get that with that.
If you're
that
lucky.
if you're lucky, because it's a minimum of $100. There's so many different things. I know that we've talked about RDSPs, things of that sort, but we're not. It's very challenging.
What's that stand for, Karen?
The Registered Disability Savings Plan, and that really helps out parents and people to be able to save. But the issue is, it's great to expand it for those families who can afford it, but we've got to look at that threshold. And there are so many families that just cannot. I was speaking to somebody yesterday, and the reason they're not getting married is because he's disabled. And by the time they move together, well, they lose their benefit because it is an Ontario benefit, and the ODSP will say it's gone. I said to him, bring it over. Let me look at your taxes. Like, this was just yesterday sitting in my living room, right? So I said, bring over your taxes. Let's see about your Canada Pension Plan disability. That will at least will give you something. But at the end of the day, that's just something. And that doesn't include the pharmaceutical benefits and all of those things. I must say, as a former dental assistant, bravo to the dental benefits. I see that expanding. And I think that is really good, because to me, I used to say the mouth opens up to a whole bunch of other things, and you can see what's happening in somebody's body via your mouth. So to me, that was a really good expansion, but we could be doing a lot better. But for families, for individuals, $200 at the cost of living right now, we need to work with our premiers across this country and figure out how to help those who are disabled through this crisis of the cost of living.
Yeah, for sure. It must be music to Peter's ear to say how much you support the Canada Dental Plan too.
Well, you know something,
Absolutely.
I'm sitting there telling my 29-year-old son, who isn't acting, saying, okay, you've got this drive to do this, and he's got all of these little jobs happening here and there. The dental benefit is a game changer for him. And I must say, way to go.
Yeah.
I've got to say this, thanks to the NDP.
There we go.
Ya'ara, what are your thoughts?
So I'm actually looking at this from a different perspective, and it brings me back to my roots of when I came into Parliament, actually, you know, when it was in the middle of the pandemic and when we were issuing the CERB. And, you know, again, if we go to good social policy, going to good economic policy, it was sort of this litmus test, or this kind of drive run of what guaranteed basic income could look like. And I think that's where the conversation really needs to go when we're talking about people who are living with disabilities. And we haven't unpacked that in a really profound way, because ultimately what it comes down to is being able to live with dignity. When I heard from so many families that even to apply for disability, to be able to qualify, the level of dignity is lost, and to reapply and to really show that you really need it. And we know that people need it. And where are we going to get to as a society where there is that basic catch, that no one will be left behind, that the basic things that they need, and even more than the basic, if you're a person with disability, that your basic needs are very different than yours or mine if you are a person with disabilities. And I think we need to recognize that. We tend to work piecemeal in the federated system of, you know, federally of, you know, adding on here and topping up there. I would really like to see us, just like we're trying to lower interprovincial trade barriers and create one system, I think looking at benefits like these of also like really looking at it from the lens of guaranteed basic income would change the playing field for so many Canadians in how they navigate their lives from a place of dignity and a place of foundational security that we haven't really considered yet. So that's where it's sitting for me right now. I mean, this is a monumental conversation and it's a big piece, but honestly, I said this when I came into Parliament as a single parent who was running a business and a mental health charity in the middle of the pandemic. My yoga studio was my happy place. It was a hobby, but it was also a place of healing for so many people. And that got shut down. And I had to make choices for me and for my staff Without the CERB, I wouldn't have had the mental health of the wherewithal that when the opportunity said, put up your hand to share your lived experience in this place, I wouldn't have had that. So we can't underestimate the power of that. And I think we need to look at disability benefits very, very differently in our relationships with the provinces and territories and the individuals who truly need it and the families who also rely on it to support loved ones.
Awesome. I just agree with everything you said. Although as moderator, I guess I'm not supposed to agree or disagree, but I'm sorry, I have opinions. So, Peter, how about you?
Well, we'll get into the discussion around fiscal discipline and where the federal government spends money now. But there can be, I agree with both Karen and Ya'ara that the issue of people with disabilities is a fundamental question of economic and social justice. The reality is nearly half of the people that are homeless in our country have a disability. Nearly half of the people that have to go to our food bank lineups to make ends meet are people with disabilities. And the reality is that the Canadian disability benefit that is being implemented as a first step was only designed to be a first step, not to be simply a small payment that only mildly alleviates the difficulties that people with disabilities suffer in our country. And so the exclusion of having a minister and the lack of any reference to people with disabilities really in the throne speech, I think is profoundly disturbing to me, because this is really the next step in terms of social policy that is also smart economic policy. And I would just reference Leah Gazan, NDP MP, one of the surviving MPs from Winnipeg Centre, who had actually moved forward a bill on the guaranteed livable basic income. So we have legislation that is there. What we need is the will and the leadership to actually take on this issue, because if we do want to build a country where where nobody is left behind, it starts with people with disabilities and seniors who are so often living below the poverty line and really struggling to make ends meet, and often not even able to keep a roof over their head because of those difficulties and challenges.
You know, I remember a disability advocate saying to me one time that it's something that any one of us tomorrow could become part of the disability community. You know, you could have a hearing impairment that happens. You could have an accident where you suddenly find yourself in a wheelchair. You could have a brain injury. All of those things, you know, it's not just people who are born with a disability, but it could happen to any one of us tomorrow. And I personally get really frustrated that the individuals are an invisible part of society when it comes to employment and so many other things that I actually want to do something at the Pearson Center on employment for people with disabilities, because there's a huge economic opportunity if we can get people contributing to the GDP who are able to and who want to be employed. Peter, you brought up fiscal discipline, so maybe I'll start with you this time, just to, you know, the Prime Minister in the throne speech promised to balance the operating spending in 3 years and bring fiscal discipline to the federal government. What do you think about that?
Well, I agree with fiscal discipline, but Mr. Cardy and myself, we have a completely different definition of what that entails. So in the throne speech, we had references to cutting services, cutting positions in the public service, cutting services that Canadians depend on, maintaining, which to my mind is freezing of healthcare transfers, when we know that the federal government has over the last couple of decades has decreased the percentage of healthcare funding going to the provinces, which has helped to provoke a healthcare crisis in many parts of our country, and also looking at freezing programs like pharmacare that we just referenced, moving ahead with the next stage of dental care beyond the end of this month. There are other steps that need to be taken for dental care to really make it accessible to all Canadians. So those are all the things that have been indicated in the throne speech as being frozen or maintained. Here is where I believe fiscal discipline should take place. We spent about $20 billion last year on corporate outsourcing. This is a doubling of services. We have public service, and then we hire corporate firms, often that do not do an effective job at all, to to double up on what our trained and professional public servants should be doing. We spend over $30 billion in overseas tax havens. We spent last year about $36 billion in oil and gas subsidies. This is billion with a B. And of course, over the last 15 years, we've seen massive largesse to prop up bank profits, including coming from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. We're talking about a quarter of $250 billion going from the CMHC to in liquidity supports to Canada's big banks to prop up their profits. So when we talk about fiscal discipline, to my mind, it starts with the lobbyist culture in Ottawa and cutting down on this incredible largesse that costs us tens of billions of dollars every year, and using that saving from that fiscal discipline to actually enhance services for people, expand pharmacare, adequately fund our healthcare across the country, and start to build affordable housing, which is something that when we're talking about affordable housing is capped at 30% of income. So the affordable housing that is market-based simply doesn't work for so many Canadians. This is how we establish fiscal discipline, and this is how we enhance services for Canadians and build the economy really from the ground up, rather than the trickle-down approach that we're seeing now that I don't think works and is being signaled in the Throne speech as continuing on. So my definition of fiscal discipline is completely different from that of Mark Carney's. I think we need to establish fiscal discipline in a way that enhances services and supports for Canadians.
Ya'ara, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts on this. When I was parliamentary secretary to Karina Gould at Families, we did a review of Service Canada as part of understanding where Canadians were accessing federal services, particularly during the pandemic and also emerging from the pandemic, on key things like EI, CPP, CERB, and so many of the supports. And of course, there was the passports at that time as well. But you know, we are a growing population, and a growing population requires public servants to deliver those services. You know, Peter, I hear you on the healthcare piece, but we also have to remind ourselves squarely where that lies in the delivery in the provinces. And, you know, I had alluded to the $200 billion in commitments that we've made to provinces and territories over the next 10 years to top up their healthcare, because we recognize the gaps were there. But I think that in being fiscally responsible, it's also about making sure that we are delivering and efficiently, but not cutting the services that people need. So there definitely are ways to deliver them better and more efficiently. And Peter, I'm with you on looking at where spends should be cut back, whether it's in outsourcing consultations or whether it's in the banking system and so on. I have many thoughts about even how we assess risk right now in trying to build housing and how the banking sector operates. You know, our banking sector today in issuing loans, if you are a commercial real estate developer, the level of risk on your loans to build the next shopping mall will be very, very low. But if you're a housing developer, to actually build the affordable housing that we need today, the level of risk on your loans is much higher. And, you know, I challenge us as Canadians, and certainly as those who are steering our bank policy and financing and, you know, how we're investing in ourselves of, you know, building housing should not be considered a risky business in this country. Building housing is an essential service. And if we are getting into the business of building homes, which the government has committed itself to, then how do we move those levers so that when CMHC is working with the financial sector to get those homes built, that we're actually looking at what the real costs are to build and making sure that they're more efficient and more affordable so that those costs don't trickle down on the final sticker price on a home for a Canadian family.
Okay, and Karen.
Happy to add in there. Living on the 401 corridor, between Windsor and Toronto, manufacturing, of course, is huge here. And we have such a large part of the population here of Southwestern Ontario when you're looking at not just Ontario, but all of Canada. So for me, manufacturing and trade is very, very important. And we have not brought up the factor that down in the United States, there's a lot of challenges with tariffs. So living in the corridor that I do, I think of the people that prior to going into the election, the people that I'd met with that, produce 100% of their items for GM or things like that are now being said, we're not going to purchase you without this tariff, and how they're trying to relocate. We have to look at what can we do here for Canadians. I also think of a company just last week here on the 401 corridor, just in Oxford County, that was handing out slips last week and getting rid of longtime employees. And so what are we going to do to maintain those jobs? This is a huge issue that we have. And so a lot of that, we need to make sure we're not only creating jobs, but we need to maintain and sustain the jobs that we currently do. And I think without making a real plan there, we need to see the plan. What is it? What is it for our farmers that are sending 80% of their goods from our agricultural region down to the United States? What are we doing there? We don't know what tomorrow's going to look like. And so I think we need to ensure we always have a backup plan. And so when we have a strong Canadian economy, we'll be able to do that. But we know that right now we do have a lot of concerns when we see that people are losing jobs.
Karen, it's funny you mentioned about, I remember meeting with Ford, which had their head office in Oakville, where I
Of
was.
course.
And I remember the Unifor 707 telling me that when Ford in St. Thomas closed, it wasn't only the people losing their jobs, it had a huge impact on the United Way and social service agencies, because those employees, Ford was the largest contributor to the United Way in St. Thomas, but also because they were unemployed, they no longer had the income to be donating. And so people think it's only an impact on the jobs, but when you have more and more people relying on food banks and things like that, when there's a huge segment of the population that loses their job, like they did at Ford in St. Thomas, it has a ripple effect throughout the community that's impacted, right?
And it's all those secondary jobs, tertiary jobs that are coming from that. So it's so much bigger. And like you said, I was so fortunate to work as a constituency assistant at that time. And in our riding, our unemployment rate was 15% in that economic downturn between 2008 and 10. And I was working with families, and we were trying to get EI benefits rolling out as soon as possible. But that is such a short stop bandage approach. So we need to make sure we don't want people on EI. We want them to be able to work. They want to be able to be employed. So what can we do there? And so we need to make sure we have a plan, because we do not know. I know that the president has come out after the throne speech and is beginning to talk a little bit here and there. But I think if we continue and work with other countries and get our trade going outside of just our US-Canada border, it will be a strong message as well.
I want to talk about Indigenous peoples in this country. There was mention of it in the throne speech, and there were promises made about free and informed consent for these large projects, while at the same time reducing approval times from 5 years to 2. I know it was a focus of the government that Ya'ara and I were part of, and I was privileged to be parliamentary secretary at Indigenous Services during the pandemic, and I saw the good that the government could do. But the challenges and issues that we're talking about right now are just amplified so much in First Nations communities. Indigenous women are the fastest growing prison population in Canada. So when I hear talk about tough on crime, Karen, we did a study on that at Status of Women. But the throne speech, sorry, I'm kind of thinking here, the throne speech mentioned Indigenous peoples, but is there enough there that is going to actually impact and allow the government to put in place and work side by side with Indigenous people on rolling out these programs? It can't be a top down. We're long past that. Ya'ara, I might start with you this time and then go to Karen, and I'll give you the last word again, Peter.
Thanks so much. And I'm actually glad we're talking about this. The journey of reconciliation that started in 2015 is continuing to unfold. But FPIC, as it's known, or free, prior, and informed consent, that even came up when we were doing the childcare legislation. And one of the most, as someone who was responsible for steering the Indigenous early learning file, Leah Gazan, Peter Julien's colleague, sorry, Peter, we had many, many discussions on this. And, I was actually pleased to see FPIC in the throne speech, because while we have adopted to have UNDRIP in all of our legislation, there's always the question of, well, what does that look like in action? What does it actually look like to have UNDRIP in each project or each thing that we do? How do we frame it in a way that it really has the teeth that it needs? And seeing free and prior informed consent in this context, I think to me is a signal that there has to be that conversation first. And no matter what we embark on, whether it's in natural resource development, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in childcare, or in all of the pieces of the puzzle, that when we work with First Nations and Indigenous communities, that the conversation starts with them, not as something that is an afterthought of including them in an existing process. And so to me, that was the signal that I took out of seeing free, prior, informed consent in the throne speech, rather than, we have a tendency to pat ourselves on the back sometimes. So, saying, look, we've adopted UNDRIP in our legislation. Well, unless we see it in action, or our Indigenous communities see that in action, it to them, it rings hollow. To me, this was a signal of understanding that those deep discussions need to happen from the start of planning, and not as an afterthought, as part of a process.
Karen, what about you?
I absolutely agree on that. And, I like to talk about being a grassroots politicians, and whether you're working with municipalities, provinces, and specifically with our Indigenous people, they must be at the table on day one. They cannot be an afterthought. When you're looking at doing something in the community, it has to be like you would do with any other community, but recognizing there's a lack of trust, right? There's a lack of trust, because what have we done for decades? And to Indigenous people, what has happened? We see clean water issues. We continue to see that. It's a very, very difficult issue, but I think it really has to be led with Indigenous people, with us as their allies. And that has just always been my thoughts on this. Is I live around some incredible communities here, Oneida and Chippewa, the Thames, and Six Nations. We see strong economies in some of our First Nations, and we know others need help. We need to be able to sit there and have those trusting conversations. And when we see pipelines, of course, has been a huge issue. We have seen a lot of protests on those. Are we actually sitting down and saying, what do the Indigenous people in this community actually want? What is it what they want? A lot of times other people are speaking for them, and I think they need to have their voices heard first.
Peter.
We have dozens of communities, Indigenous communities in this country, that still don't have access to clean water, or their boiled water advisories. We have a massive housing crisis, affordable housing crisis in Indigenous communities across the country. It's been more than 2 years since the last time one of the 100 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was actually implemented. So this is a moral imperative. This is something that the Parliament of Canada, the government of Canada, Mr. Carney as Prime Minister, has to take on. So I'm happy about the reference to free, prior, and informed consent, but I'm confused by references in the throne speech to fast tracking, which is really bulldozing approval for projects of national significance, moving that to 2-year maximum. Now, Mr. Harper tried to do the same thing, and I actually filibustered the 2012 budget, spoke for 14 hours, because the intent of the Conservative government at the time was to fast track, to bulldoze these things through. Ultimately, it didn't result in any projects being built, because the reality is Indigenous peoples have access to the court system. So without free, prior, and informed consent, the promise around fast tracking projects and somehow pushing them down to a 2-year approval level is really an empty commitment. And I believe, as I think we all do, that we need to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent is in part of every government action. How this happens, I think, is still an open question, and we'll have to see what the government brings forward in terms of legislation and in terms of actual concrete steps to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent is part and parcel of government policy moving forward.
You know, when I was Parliamentary Secretary at Indigenous Services, Karen had mentioned GBA plus, gender-based analysis plus. I feel like every decision the government makes should go through an Indigenous lens before it goes to cabinet. And I know it's supposed to be part of the plus, but you know, if it was part of actual cabinet documents right at the very get-go, and they had to look at what impact, whether, you know, you mentioned housing and clean water, Peter, but addictions and mental health issues in Indigenous communities is in some, it's just horrible. States of emergency have been declared because it's so bad. So, so we've still got some time, which is great. I'm going to leave Canada, US till the end because everybody's talking about Canada, US, and I think there's lots of things that we can talk about that isn't necessarily getting the focus. And Karen, you know, we talked a little bit about housing, but Peter, thoughts on housing and what was in the throne speech and the direction that the government's taking?
There again, I think this needs clarification. What we need, and I'm going to take a moment. I know we've got a lot of questions to answer, but I'm just going to take a moment to reference the last time the NDP was not an officially recognized party. That was the 1993 to 1997 Parliament. It was during that time that the Chrétien government eliminated the National Housing Program, which has contributed to the housing crisis in a very real way that we're experiencing today. I didn't see a reference in the throne speech to ensuring that we are putting back into place substantial funding for cooperative housing, social housing, housing that is based on the principle of no more than 30% of a person's income, family's income, going to housing. That is affordable housing. When we talk about market prices in this area, in New Westminster, Burnaby, Millardville, we're talking about $2,500 for a one-bedroom apartment a month. I mean, that is simply not affordable for the vast majority of regular working people. And certainly people who are on fixed incomes, it's impossible. And so I didn't see a reference to that affordable housing threshold of 30% of income. I didn't see reference in the throne speech to putting in place that national workshops so that we're building affordable housing again, cooperative housing and social housing. I did see some references to investing in Build Canada and ensuring that we have tradespeople to build the new housing. That's an important step. But if we do it by subsidizing corporate landlords at market prices rather than building affordable housing that people can actually afford, we are not going to resolve the housing crisis. And so I think the omission of references to specific thresholds in affordable housing, 30% of income, and cooperative housing and social housing, I think is disturbing and saddening. And I hope this is not the track that the government is taking, just continuing to subsidize corporate landlords rather than putting in place affordable housing that families can actually live in and that are sustainable for them.
Ya'ara, and then I'll turn to you, Karen.
Oh, I'm chomping at the bit to weigh in on this, so thank you. So I agree with Peter, we really do need to focus on cooperative housing and what affordable housing looks like for Canadians today. Not just in urban centers like where I am in Toronto, but across the country in Indigenous communities. So one of the things that we worked on previously was the long-term land lease policy of federal lands to unlock them towards housing. We made that commitment. And I'm proud to say I was one of the drivers of this. I'm a builder's kid and came to Jean-Yves Duclos, who was our Minister of Procurement, and said, you know, rather than selling off federal assets, why aren't we leveraging them to build the homes that Canadians need on them? Because in long-term land lease, we are the landlords. We decide what gets built on those lands and the terms of reference in terms of affordability and all the things that Peter just referenced. And that was really the driver for me to get that in place. There's 300 plus properties that have been identified across the country to be slated for that kind of building. And I am cautiously optimistic, but I think there will need to be voices to remind the government that they put this policy in place, and that if we're looking at the new Build Canada Homes project that's proposed by the government now, how are they going to leverage the lands assets that they have to really fulfill those previous commitments that we made about cooperative housing, like in Budget 2024, or the deeply affordable pieces that we really want to unlock, because we can drive this bus. But the question is, will they be thoughtful enough in really leveraging those spaces to set the bar, like what Peter said, of what are the goals of the housing that we're going to build? What does deeply affordable look to a Canadian family today, and making sure that we're delivering it for them?
Well, that ownership is critically important. I remember when I was on Oakville Council, Canada Land sold a parcel of land in Oakville, and once it's sold, there's no control over it. And
Exactly.
so
So the long-term
there was
land
no
lease,
affordable
yeah,
housing built on there. They were all $2 million townhouses that went in. So as soon as you've sold that to a developer, you lose control over what gets put on there.
yeah. So I'm
Karen?
excited to see how
Yeah.
they leverage it.
Sorry, I'm going to come in as the stinky sock here. And I think it's because between 2015 and 19, as the critic for families, children, and social development, the National Housing Strategy came out at that time. I looked at data, and if we see where we were in May of 2021 compared to May of 2015, we see an extravagant change. And I know that Peter talked about the $2,600 rent for an apartment. That has become reality, and we don't see those things coming down. That is really, really hard, especially for our youth that are coming out of universities and getting their first-time jobs, who aren't being able to get into a home. And when we talk about $400,000 for our first home, just 23 years ago, I bought the home that I'm sitting in for $114,000. I recognize that, the generation before had less. And if we look at it, yes, it's less and less and less. But, we're talking about people getting into their first time homes at $600,000 to start. And that's just unachievable for so many young people.
Karen, I just have to say, if you come to Oakville, you're probably starting at about $1.5 million. So
you guys are always at number one. Way to go, way to go. But
no, it's horrible though.
You live in a lovely neighborhood, but it just can't live there.
No.
But I look at some great projects. We have projects here in St. Thomas. We have one that's tiny homes. It's focused on violence against women, singular family homes for an individual and her children, as well as individuals themselves. But on to Ya'ara's point, I think one of my concerns is, yes, that federal lands is a really big piece. And in 2015, they were asking for the same thing. 300 spots. They're the spot identified in London, in our region. There's only one spot that I know of identified in the core, and it's on Queen Street. And we need so much more than that. Yes, it's a start. It is a start. I appreciate that. But we need 95% or 95 times more than that. And so that's where I sit there and go, great idea, but we need more. So let's start focusing on every tentacle that we possibly can.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left, and I guess we can't talk about what's happening right now without bringing up Canada, US. So Ya'ara, I'm going to start with you this time, like thoughts on what, and you can touch on unity because you also brought that up. I've seen certainly since the US election, Canadians come together in a way that, we haven't seen. People have set aside their differences to even politically, to say we need to have a united front. But what were your thoughts on the whole Canada US thing in relation to the throne speech?
So I think going into or coming out of the throne speech, the first thought to me was, or the opening remarks really talked about Canada vis-a-vis the world and how we engage. If you look at the 7 points of the throne speech, the building was building new relationships with US and the world. We are the G7 partner with more free trade agreements than any other one of our other members. But how do we leverage those? How do we make them work for us? How do we ensure that, Karen mentioned manufacturing and industry and all of those pieces of the puzzle. How are we going to put those into action? It's really going to matter. I will say, certainly on the file that I held previously as minister, hearing this morning that the courts determined that the fentanyl tariffs were not justified, having gone through really an extensive process of bringing our regs are quite robust on fentanyl in this country. In fact, we are the international standard that many other countries look to. But we spent a tremendous amount of time bringing those regs completely in line with the US in the early parts of this year when the Trump administration came in, to make sure that we are all on the same page when it comes to the opioid crisis. And I'll allude to that because it is a North American phenomenon. So when we talk about US, Canada, or even Mexico relations, that is part of the puzzle, but it really should be done from a place of working together rather than a punitive lever, which I was happy to see was struck down today. I think we need to not just only hold our own, but hold our own elsewhere, not just with the US, and show that we are leading. And I certainly think that Prime Minister Carney has tried to do that. And certainly the Throne speech was the first piece of that puzzle certainly for me.
Thank you. Peter, how about you?
Well, I think New Democrats would say we told you so. The idea of putting all the eggs in the American basket is something that the NDP has spoken up repeatedly about over the last couple of decades. And now we need a strategy that makes sense. I think it's clear that the first thing is we have to stop it being exporting raw logs, raw minerals, raw bitumen. We have simply exported products, particularly to the United States, without a forethought of building the kind of manufacturing capacity that Karen was talking about, and that is so essential to our economic well-being. Secondly, we have not had, up until now, and I think part of the unity that Ya'ara was speaking about has resulted in provincial governments now making that decision to start buying Canadian. And we've had the United States always emphasizing Buy America without a similar Buy Canada program for particularly for government procurement. Thirdly, the issue of trade diversification. As trade critic, I traveled to many places in the world, and speaking with our trade commissioners, they often didn't even have the budget to buy a cup of coffee for a potential client of Canadian exports. And so when we look at other countries, Australia, the European community, the United States, they invest heavily in supporting their export development. We need to diversify our trade. That starts by putting in place the investments so that we're actually supporting our exports right around the world. Those are the three things that have to happen coming out of this. I think there is unity in Canada around this question. We need action from the government. In the Throne speech, there were no specifics. I certainly hope the specifics are coming, and that includes these kinds of investments, because that is the way to ensure the long-term health and well-being of our economy in a way that's export stimulated, but also manufacturing based, and ensuring that we've got the good jobs of tomorrow for our economy.
Well, Karen, last word to you in 2 minutes. And I know it's a big topic, but we'll give the last word to you. And you're on mute, Karen.
There we go. So I'm just going to make it really simple. And I have always said politics is about the people, and it's about psychology. It's about what makes people tick. So if we want to look at across the world, they saw the King of England, the King of Canada come here and give the Throne speech. So we got a whole new audience to those people that may say, Canada's open for business. And that is what we want to say. To the Americans, to the United States, the number of conversations that I've had with people that are good friends, sometimes relatives, it's like, we'll come to see you. We'll see you in 3.5 years, because they joke that I won't get across the border. But, it's one of those things we need to do. We need to make sure that we have good quality policies and plans against the President of the United States right now when he's talking about manufacturing, when he's talking about the Buy American. We've heard it from previous governments down in the United States when we had, there was the country of origin labeling that was put in by Obama. Those types of things. We need to be really, really careful with the rhetoric and ensure that not only are we buying local and buying Canadian, but what are we doing when it comes to our own manufacturing here too? So I think there's lots to do, but I think it was positive on Wednesday or on Tuesday. I'll be really honest. I think it was very positive.
Well, before I turn it over to Kevin to close things off, I just want to thank whoops, I hit my computer there. I want to thank the three of you, and I hope that we can do this again and make it a regular thing that there'll be lots of issues that come up, and I think it's really, really important to bring these, diversity of perspectives to the table, We will send this out to all the MPs and senators. I don't know how many will watch or listen to it, but I certainly hope that there are more than a few. So thanks to all of you. And Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Pam, and thank you to Peter, Ya'ara, and Karen for doing this. And I thought it was a wonderful discussion, and I love that there was a diversity of opinion, and we're hearing from people from across the country, and that's what the Pearson Center is all about, being a platform for discussions of the important ideas of the day. And we do not have to agree on everything, and I think it's wonderful that we hear different approaches. So I couldn't be more grateful for all of you sharing your expertise and your insight with us today. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, Pam, for moderating this great discussion. This is just one of what we plan to be a series of these webinars / podcasts throughout the year. So we really appreciate everyone joining us. I will throw in a plug for our next major upcoming event. We have the Pearson Laureate Dinner. This is our major event every year. We're having this in Ottawa on June 11th. In the past, we've had dinners honoring Jean Chrétien and Joe Clark. This year, we're honoring the wonderful Irwin Cotler, who folks will know is
It's on mute.
Can't hear you.
You're on mute there, Kevin.
Sorry about that. I got muted. So anyway, Irwin's a longtime human rights activist, former Minister of Justice, just an incredible human being. So if you haven't got your tickets yet to that event, I would urge you to go to our website for the Pearson Center, and please join us on June 11th in Ottawa. We expect many parliamentarians, past and present, to be joining us. So thank you all. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Et à la prochaine fois. Next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.